Humanity never saw it coming. One moment, they were masters of their own planet, and the next, they were reduced to prey. The Vorax arrived in a spectacle of fire and destruction, their ships blackening the sky, their soldiers marching through the streets with a chilling, methodical precision. Unlike past invaders from science fiction, they didn't care for conquest or diplomacy. They weren't here to colonize, steal resources, or establish dominion. They were here for entertainment. The concept of sport was universal, it seemed. On their homeworld, the Vorax engaged in ritualized hunting as a test of strength, skill, and dominance. When they discovered Earth, they saw an opportunity, an entire species ripe for the greatest blood sport in the galaxy. Human survival instincts, their unpredictability, their ability to adapt, these qualities made them perfect prey. At first, humanity fought back in the only way they knew how. Governments scrambled to mount a resistance, but the Vorax were too advanced. They neutralized nuclear weapons with ease, crushed military opposition without breaking stride. Cities were turned into open hunting grounds, where high-ranking Vorax warriors would compete for the most impressive kills. Wealthy alien elites placed bets on how long specific humans would last. The longest survival times were recorded, broadcasted, and analyzed like a perverse leaderboard. Jake Carter had lasted longer than most. A former Marine, he had the skills to survive, but survival wasn't enough. He'd spent the last year watching others die, his squad, his friends, his family. He had seen men and women reduced to nothing more than sport for creatures that saw them as nothing more than animals. Hiding among the ruins of Chicago, he'd learned how to move unseen, how to stay ahead of the trackers that prowled the night. The rules of this new world were clear: never stay in one place too long, never let your guard down, and never, ever think of yourself as safe. The Vorax were efficient hunters. They had technology that could read body heat from miles away, drones that patrolled the streets with pinpoint accuracy. Some of them even enjoyed giving their prey a false sense of security, watching them scramble for food, watching them think they were alone, just to strike when they least expected it. Jake had learned early on that direct confrontation was suicide. Humans weren't built for this kind of war. They were outmatched in every way, except one. The Vorax, for all their power, were arrogant. They assumed humans would act like lesser creatures, predictable in their fear. That arrogance gave Jake his only advantage. Survivors whispered about something out there in the dark, something that had turned the hunt back on the hunters. Some called it a ghost, others a demon. The stories varied. Some said it was an experiment gone wrong, a soldier enhanced beyond human capability. Others believed it was just a legend, something desperate people told themselves to cling to hope. The Vorax found the idea amusing. They laughed at the primitive human superstition. To them, humans were weak. They relied on myths and fantasies to mask their helplessness. The boogeyman was nothing more than a fable, an imaginary figure conjured up to give the prey a sense of false security. Then the disappearances began. It started small, 1 or 2 hunting squads failing to report back. At first, the Vorax assumed it was mechanical failure, some minor malfunction with their communications. But then they found the first bodies. 3 elite hunters, skinned and hung from the ruins of a burned-out skyscraper. That was the moment fear entered the equation. The Vorax, for all their technological superiority, had never encountered a predator they didn't understand. Every species they had ever hunted had one thing in common: they ran. But someone, wasn't running. Jake didn't know what to believe. He'd heard the stories like everyone else, but until he saw the aftermath with his own eyes, he'd dismissed them as wishful thinking. But there was no mistaking the truth. Something had killed those hunters, and it wasn't luck. It was precise, methodical, and cruel. For the first time since the invasion, the Vorax weren't laughing. The Vorax elite hunter, Tovash, was accustomed to easy kills. He had hunted humans since the beginning of the blood sport, racking up a record number of kills. To him, humans were nothing more than clever vermin, amusing in their defiance, predictable in their desperation. He enjoyed the chase, the thrill of letting them think they had escaped, only to strike when their hope was at its peak. So when he and his squad cornered a lone human in the ruins of what was once a bank, he felt no urgency, no real concern. The human, a gaunt, filthy man clutching a rusted pipe, looked at them with wide, terrified eyes. Tovash clicked his mandibles in amusement. Another easy kill. The hunt had gone on long enough. He raised his plasma caster, taking his time, savoring the moment. The human's mouth moved, whispering something Tovash couldn't hear. Begging? Praying? It didn't matter. Then the lights went out. The squad's visors adjusted instantly, switching to infrared, but by the time they recalibrated, one of their own was gone. No scream, no sound, just missing. Tovash barked an order, his voice a sharp growl in the darkness. The remaining three spread out, forming a defensive triangle. He switched to motion tracking, scanning the shadows. Something moved, too fast. Another Vorax fell, his throat sliced open so precisely that no blood had even splattered yet. His body hit the floor a second later. Torvash's amusement was gone. He fired into the darkness, his squad mates doing the same, plasma bolts scorching walls and furniture, lighting up the room in bursts of flickering blue. Silence. Then a whisper. "You're not the only ones who enjoyed the hunt." Tovash turned, swinging his blade, but it was too late. A gloved hand wrenched his weapon arm back, another wrapped around his throat. His second-in-command, seeing him struggle, hesitated for just a fraction of a second, long enough for a knife to sink into his skull. Tovash fought, twisting, kicking, trying to shake the thing off him. He was strong, stronger than any human, but the grip on his throat tightened, cutting off his air. Then, for the first time in his life, he felt it, fear. A quiet voice whispered in his ear. "Now you understand." Darkness swallowed him. The disappearance of Tovash sent ripples of unease through the Vorax command structure. Losing a hunting squad wasn't unusual. Humans sometimes got lucky, ambushing isolated units with traps or explosives. But losing Tovash? That was different. He had been one of their best. He didn't make mistakes. His body was never found. Within days, more hunters vanished. Some were discovered later, stripped of their weapons, their bodies mutilated and displayed like trophies. Others simply ceased to exist, as if swallowed by the planet itself. Vorax analysts reviewed surveillance footage, desperate to understand what they were dealing with. What they saw didn't make sense. One clip, taken from a helmet cam, showed a Vorax patrol moving through an abandoned subway station. The feed was clear, steady, until, without warning, the soldier at the rear was yanked into the shadows. No scream, no struggle. One moment he was there, the next gone. Another recording captured the last moments of a commander, as he frantically fired his plasma rifle at a figure darting through the darkness. The shots missed. The figure got closer. And then, static. The Vorax High Warlord dismissed the reports at first, believing it was merely human resistance tactics escalating. But when the missing count reached triple digits, he was forced to take action. Still, he did not fear. Fear was for the weak. He had commanded battles across the galaxy, crushed rebellions, exterminated entire species. Humans were pests, resourceful pests, but pests nonetheless. His confidence lasted until his son disappeared. The young warrior had gone on a private hunt, eager to prove himself. He had taken an elite escort, confident that he would return with trophies. Instead, his severed head was delivered to the High Warlord's personal quarters, wrapped in the tattered remains of his ceremonial hunting cloak. Carved into his forehead was a message in the Vorax tongue. "You are not hunters. You are prey." For the first time, the High Warlord hesitated. Velcash, the undefeated champion of the bloodsport, had never known defeat. He had hunted creatures that could crush tanks, stalked beings that could kill with a thought. To him, humans were nothing more than a minor challenge, something to pass the time. He volunteered to hunt the boogeyman. There was no hesitation in his step as he set out, accompanied by the most advanced tracking drones and a squad of the best warriors the Vorax had to offer. The High Warlord watched him go, his expression unreadable. Hours passed. Then days. The first signs of trouble came when one of Velcash's warriors staggered back into the outpost, covered in blood, none of it his own. His armor was slashed open, his weapons gone. His eyes, once sharp with the confidence of a killer, were wide with something else. Terror. He could barely speak, his mandibles clicking erratically as he muttered the same thing over and over. It is death. It walks like a man, but it is death. Velcash's skull was found the next day, his fangs shattered, his body hanging from the ruins of an old highway overpass. The boogeyman wasn't a myth. And the Vorax finally understood, they were being hunted. Jake had never believed in ghosts. He had seen too much, lost too many, to put stock in stories whispered among desperate survivors. But after what he had seen, after what the Vorax had seen, he wasn't so sure anymore. The boogeyman was real. And now, he was determined to find him. Tracking a phantom was no easy task. Jake moved carefully, following the trails of destruction left behind. The Vorax were still reeling from their losses, their patrols moving in larger, more defensive formations. The hunters had become the hunted, and they knew it. He found his first real clue in an abandoned Vorax outpost, a place that had once been a hub for their hunting operations. Now it was a graveyard. Bodies lay scattered, the walls smeared with alien blood. Whoever had done this hadn't just killed the Vorax, they had made an example of them. And there, carved into the metal plating of the command console, were words written in English. "You're not safe. You never were." Jake's breath caught. He knew that handwriting. The realization hit him like a gut punch. There was only one man he had ever known who could do something like this. A man who had been presumed dead months ago, taken in one of the early raids. Marcus Graves. Before the invasion, Graves had been a legend in the Special Forces, Black Ops, deep cover, the kind of soldier they sent in when no one else could get the job done. If anyone could turn the tables on the Vorax, it was him. And somehow, against all odds, he was still alive. It took days for Jake to find him. Graves wasn't making it easy, he was leaving trails for the Vorax, but not for humans. Still, Jake knew how his old friend thought. He followed the patterns, the misdirections, until finally, deep in the ruins of a collapsed stadium, he found him. Or rather, Graves found him. The blade was at Jake's throat before he even knew he was being watched. A strong hand gripped his shoulder, pinning him in place. "Been a long time, Jake." Jake didn't move. He knew better. "Yeah. Long time." The blade lowered. Graves stepped into the light, and for the first time in a year, Jake saw his face. He looked the same, almost. There were new scars, fresh wounds that hadn't fully healed. His eyes were different, too. Sharper. Colder. "They told me you were dead," Jake said. Graves smirked. "They were wrong." Jake exhaled, shaking his head. "You've been busy." Graves didn't deny it. "Somebody had to be." There was silence for a moment. Then Jake asked the question that had been burning in his mind since he first heard the rumors. "How did you survive?" Graves' expression darkened. He looked past Jake, toward the city skyline, what was left of it. "They took me," he said simply. "Took a lot of us. We weren't just prey, Jake. We were experiments." Jake felt a chill run through him. "What kind of experiments?" Graves turned back to him, and for the first time, Jake saw something in his eyes he hadn't expected. Hate. They wanted to see how far they could push us. How much pain we could take before we broke. How much fight was left in us before we stopped being human. Jake swallowed hard. He had heard stories about the captured, about the ones who didn't make it. Graves let out a slow breath. "They thought they were breaking me. But all they did was show me how to kill them better." Graves had a plan. He had spent months studying the Vorax, learning their weaknesses. He had sabotaged their weapons, disrupted their tracking systems, made them fear the dark. But it wasn't enough. If they wanted to end the blood sport, they needed to strike where it hurt the most. The supply depot. The Vorax relied on constant shipments from their main fleet, weapons, food, reinforcements. If they could take out the depot, they could cripple the operation and send a message to the High Warlord himself. Jake listened as Graves laid out the attack. It was suicide. The depot was heavily guarded, and if the Vorax so much as suspected a threat, they would wipe out everything within a mile radius. But Jake didn't hesitate. "When do we start?" Graves smirked. "That's the Jake I remember." They moved at night. The depot was nestled in the wreckage of an old industrial zone, surrounded by high walls and automated turrets. But Graves had been watching for months. He knew the blind spots, the weaknesses. They slipped through undetected, planting explosives at key structural points. The plan was simple: blow the main generators, disable the force fields, and let chaos do the rest. Jake watched as Graves worked, moving like a ghost through the shadows. He wasn't just fighting a war, he was waging something personal. This wasn't about survival for him. It was about revenge. As the final charge was set, Jake heard a sound that sent his pulse racing. Footsteps. They weren't alone. A squad of Vorax patrollers entered the depot, scanning the area. If they were caught, it was over. Jake pressed himself against the wall, fingers tightening around his rifle. Graves didn't move. He waited. Silent. Calculating. Then, in a blur of motion, he was gone. One by one, the Vorax fell. No gunfire, no screams. Just bodies hitting the floor. When Graves reappeared, his knife was dripping with black alien blood. "All clear," he muttered, wiping it off. Jake exhaled. "You always were dramatic." Graves grinned. "Wouldn't want to disappoint." They set the detonators and slipped away just as the first explosion rocked the depot. Flames erupted, lighting up the night sky. Jake didn't look back. The message had been sent. By morning, the Vorax knew what had happened. The depot was gone. Dozens of hunters were dead. And the human resistance had struck a blow they couldn't ignore. Graves didn't send a message in the usual way. No broadcasts, no declarations. He didn't need them. He left a single body outside the Vorax command post. The corpse of their highest-ranking officer in the sector. Carved into his chest, in perfect Vorax script, were 4 words. "You thought we were prey." The game had changed. And the real hunt had just begun. The Vorax did not take humiliation lightly. The destruction of the supply depot, the growing list of their best hunters vanishing without a trace, the mutilated body of their commander left as a message, these were offenses they could not ignore. The High Warlord had underestimated humanity, but he would not make that mistake again. The retaliation came swiftly. The Vorax deployed their most feared warriors, the nightstalkers. Unlike the standard hunters, the nightstalkers were bred for war. Larger, faster, and infinitely more brutal, they did not toy with their prey. They did not give chase for sport. They killed swiftly and without hesitation. Where the Vorax warriors found joy in the thrill of the hunt, the nightstalkers found only duty. Their presence alone sent a wave of unease through the remaining survivors. Those who had learned how to hide from the hunters found their tricks useless. The nightstalkers didn't just track, they predicted. They anticipated movements, cutting off escape routes before their targets even knew they were in danger. Jake and Graves had seen the reports, intercepted the transmissions. The Vorax weren't sending nightstalkers to hunt scattered humans. They were sending them to eliminate one specific target. The boogeyman. "They're scared," Jake muttered as he and Graves watched from the ruins of a skyscraper, observing the nightstalker patrols moving below. Graves didn't take his eyes off the enemy. "Good." Jake shook his head. "You don't understand. They're not scared of humans. They're scared of you." Graves let out a low chuckle. "Then let's give them something to be afraid of." The trap was set. Graves had been waiting for this moment, anticipating that the Vorax would escalate. He and Jake worked quickly, laying out an ambush in the twisted remains of an old city block. Improvised explosives, sniper positions, bottleneck corridors, every inch of the battlefield was planned. The nightstalkers moved in with military precision. There was no hesitation in their approach, no wasted motion. They did not fear their target. They had been bred to kill, and that certainty made them formidable. But Graves had spent too long studying his enemy. He knew their strengths, and their weaknesses. The first explosion ripped through the lead formation, scattering flaming debris across the street. The nightstalkers barely flinched. Their armor was thick, their reflexes sharp. They regrouped instantly, scanning for their attacker. That was their second mistake. The first was coming here at all. Graves moved like a ghost through the rubble, striking from the shadows. A blade to the throat, a silent shot from a suppressed rifle, a tripwire leading to another explosion. He dismantled them piece by piece. Jake provided cover from above, taking out targets with well-placed shots. But the nightstalkers adapted quickly. They changed their formation, moving unpredictably. One of them locked onto Jake's position and fired a plasma bolt, narrowly missing his head. Jake ducked, rolling away as the concrete exploded beside him. "They're getting smarter," he called out. Graves, locked in a brutal hand-to-hand fight with one of the nightstalkers, barely spared him a glance. "So am I." He twisted his blade, driving it deeper into the alien's chest. It let out a guttural hiss before collapsing. The battle was turning. The nightstalkers, for all their superiority, had never fought an enemy like this. Graves wasn't running. He wasn't hiding. He was fighting on his terms, and he was winning. Then the transmission came through. A garbled message on the stolen Vorax communicator, barely intelligible over the static. "Human asset captured. Female. Confirmed relation." Jake froze. His stomach dropped. Graves turned to him, reading the look on his face. "Who?" Jake clenched his fists. "My sister." The stronghold was a fortress. Jake had known the Vorax would use anything they could to draw them out. They weren't just hunting the boogeyman anymore. They were setting a trap. And it was working. Graves studied the layout of the stronghold, analyzing the defenses. "They want us to come," he said. "They're expecting it." Jake nodded. "I don't care." Graves sighed, rubbing his face. "That's what they're counting on, Jake. They think they can use her to control you." Jake met his gaze. "They're wrong." Graves gave a short nod. "Then let's prove it." The assault was fast and brutal. Graves and Jake moved like a force of nature, cutting through the perimeter defenses before the Vorax even knew what hit them. Explosions ripped through the compound as they breached the main structure, fighting their way through waves of alien guards. Jake had one focus: his sister. He didn't hesitate. He didn't slow down. He moved with a fury that even the Vorax had never seen before. They reached the holding cells, taking down the final guards. Jake forced the door open and there she was, bruised, but alive. The moment she saw him, she ran into his arms. Jake barely had time to breathe before Graves grabbed his shoulder. "We need to go." But something was wrong. The silence was too complete. The fight had been too easy. Then the alarms started blaring. The Vorax weren't trying to stop them from escaping. They were sealing them inside. Graves spun, scanning the exits. "They're bringing the whole place down." Jake grabbed his sister's hand. "We run." They sprinted through the collapsing halls as explosions rocked the structure. Graves led the way, calculating the fastest route out. The heat from the detonations grew unbearable, flames licking at their heels. Then, just as they reached the final exit, a massive figure stepped into their path. The High Warlord himself. Graves didn't slow. Neither did the Warlord. They collided in a blur of motion, weapons flashing, blood spraying. Jake barely had time to react before Graves shouted at him. "Get her out of here!" Jake hesitated. "I'm not leaving you." Graves grinned, despite the fight. "You've got more to fight for. Now go." Jake cursed, grabbing his sister and hauling her toward the exit. The last thing he saw was Graves, locked in a death struggle with the Vorax leader, flames rising around them. And then the building collapsed. Jake stood outside, breathing hard, staring at the wreckage. There was no sign of Graves. The boogeyman was gone. But the war wasn't over. Not yet. The Vorax had won a battle, but they had lost the war. The boogeyman was gone, buried beneath the ruins of their stronghold, locked in mortal combat with their high warlord. They had expected that with his death, the resistance would crumble, that humans would fall back into their roles as prey. They were wrong. Marcus Graves had become more than a man. He was a myth now, a story whispered among survivors, a nightmare that still lingered in the minds of the Vorax. The message he had carved into their commander's corpse still rang true. You thought we were prey. And now, the hunters were the hunted. The Vorax were retreating. Their forces were fractured, their morale shattered. They had spent years believing themselves to be untouchable, gods in a galaxy of lesser beings. But humans had done something no species before them had accomplished. They had made the Vorax afraid. Jake Carter stood atop the ruins of a fallen city, watching the alien warships break orbit. He had fought, bled, lost people he loved, but he was still here. And he wasn't done fighting yet. Because this wasn't just about revenge anymore. This was about survival. The resistance was no longer a scattered group of survivors. Graves had started something, and now Jake was going to finish it. Across the world, humans who had once cowered in the shadows began to rise. They had learned the art of war from the Vorax. They had studied their weaknesses, adapted to their tactics. The same guerrilla methods that had kept them alive now became their greatest weapon. No longer did they hide. No longer did they run. They struck back. Across the ruins of once great cities, human fighters launched coordinated attacks, targeting Vorax supply chains, disabling their remaining strongholds. They fought not just with stolen alien weapons but with their own ingenuity, their own will to survive. The Vorax, once confident in their dominance, began pulling back, consolidating their forces. They had underestimated humanity once, and it had cost them dearly. They would not make that mistake again. But the damage had already been done. Their empire had been tarnished. Their reputation shattered. And now, across the galaxy, other enslaved species were watching. If humans could fight back, if humans could win, what was stopping them from doing the same? The last remaining Vorax warship lingered in Earth's orbit, its commanders hesitant, their pride wounded. This had been their arena, their hunting ground. Now it was a graveyard for their best warriors. Jake knew they would return one day. Maybe not soon. Maybe not in his lifetime. But the Vorax were not the kind to forget humiliation. So he left them a message. The Resistance hijacked an alien transmission beacon, tapping into the Vorax communications network. Across the galaxy, those who once watched humanity suffer now heard something different. Jake stood before the camera, scarred but standing, staring directly into the lens. You thought we were weak. You thought we would fall. He leaned in, his voice cold. Come back if you want. His lips curled into a smirk. But remember, the boogeyman is watching. And with that, Earth went silent. The war wasn't over. But it was humanity's turn to hunt.